Hi, hello, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into different types of paints that you use with water. And what I mean by water is not just watercolor. We'll definitely be talking about watercolor, but I'm also meaning anything where you might thin a little bit with water or even just wash your brushes with water. So we won't be covering anything that has to do with oils and things like that. I will be talking about three main types of paint and then some of the subsets that fall under that. We're going to start off with watercolor. Watercolor is a water-soluble paint. It typically combines a pigment plus a water-soluble binder, and then the main mode of transportation is using some water on a brush or mixing up water plus the paint to then be applied to paper most commonly. You can apply watercolor to other more porous materials, but it will have different effects than what it has on paper. It's sold in a couple different formats. You can buy tubes that have a creamy-like consistency paint inside of them. Most often though, it's seen sold in these little half pans of watercolor that are dried, but you can also see it sold in a variety of other formats like liquid or even powdered. The next medium we're going to be talking about is gouache, and typically it comes in tubes of paints like this, but you're probably most familiar with this Hemi palette. It's quite a famous palette because it looks so neat. It's a jelly gouache, and it comes with little cubes of gouache, and you've probably seen it over every single social media. What exactly is gouache? Now, gouache is often called an opaque version of watercolor because it has a very similar kind of base structure. It is a pigment plus a water-soluble binder, but then it usually also includes some more opaque type inert material that gives it a little more body. It's known for its really vibrant colors and also a lot of coverage. Most commonly, people paint it on paper, but it can be applied to a wide variety of surfaces like canvases, wood, hard panels, pretty much anything that you can paint on. Once dry, gouache is typically a matte color. And finally, we're going to be talking about acrylic paint. Acrylic paint comes in a lot of different formats, and we'll talk about a couple of those later, but in essence, it is pigment suspended in a water and polymer solution. When it's dried, it's basically plastic. However, while it's wet, it can be thinned with water. Acrylic is most common applied to canvases, but it can also be applied to paper, hard panels, wood, anything you can paint on. Most forms of acrylic paint, once dry, have a shiny finish to them. However, there are mediums that can change that. Also, we're going to be talking about acrylic gouache. Typically, if I were talking to somebody about water media, I would only be talking about watercolor and gouache. However, I've been talking about acrylic here too, and the reason is acrylic gouache. Because acrylic gouache popped up a couple years ago, and I have been duped not once, but twice when I was trying to purchase normal gouache into buying acrylic gouache. And acrylic gouache is normal gouache, but they put those polymer binders, the same things that make acrylic paint stick to the canvas, they put that within the gouache, meaning that once it's dry, it's no longer water soluble. Just like acrylic paint, it can be applied to pretty much any painting surface. So what is the big difference between all these different mediums? And I think the best way to do this is to make this kind of almost graph of different art supplies and how closely related they are to each other. On one side we have watercolor. This is the most water soluble of all the mediums because water is kind of the star of the show when you're using it. And on the other side is acrylic paint. Watercolor is typically a more transparent medium, so you're going to see all the layers throughout. You're going to see anything that's painted underneath if you use a light touch or if you did a drawing over the top. Whereas acrylic, depending on the brand, can have a huge amount of coverage. You can also make it textured. It can stand up from the page. And there are ways to modify watercolor, but not as many as acrylic. There's a ton of different mediums you can use with acrylic. You can make it glossier, you can make it dry slower, you can mattify the medium, you can also add different textures to it. Whereas most watercolor you just use with water and just kind of let the paint do what it needs to do on the paper. The biggest difference between watercolor and acrylic is that once it's completely dried, acrylic is set in place completely. It doesn't budge, it doesn't move, it is permanent. And watercolor is permanent too. It's going to stay in place unless you mess with it. By adding more water to watercolor, you're going to reactivate it, you can lift it a bit, you can also manipulate it a little bit more. Typically, we try not to do this between layers, but it is possible. Within this, one of my favorite things about watercolor is if you leave watercolor paint in your brush overnight and it dries, all you need to do is swish it around in some water and it's going to be good to go again. We've established three main differences between watercolor and acrylic: transparency, the ability to re-wet and rework once dry, and texture. And gouache falls kind of right in between these two for a few reasons. On one hand, it's very opaque, so it's going to have a lot of coverage. It's not going to be transparent like watercolor, so that's going to put it kind of pulling towards the acrylic side. You can also use gouache in a thicker manner to get a bit more texture, kind of like what you can do with acrylic. Not quite as thick, but definitely more texture than watercolor. But the reason why it's right in the middle is that re-wetting ability. Because once gouache has dried, you can re-wet it and you can manipulate it, which means a few things. If you're working on a painting, you let it dry, you wanted to come back and make some edits, you can still blend and do some things to the background that's already set on there without having to completely cover it up. It also means that if you let gouache dry in your brush, it's not the end of the world. Let's take a moment to talk about acrylic gouache, because this needs to fall somewhere on this scale too. And just as an FYI, when you are going to purchase gouache, be a little bit careful and really read the labels, because it is easier than you think to purchase acrylic gouache. When I got curious about learning to paint with gouache, I not once but twice bought acrylic gouache from different manufacturers. And now that I'm kind of far into this journey, I know what to look for, but as somebody who's trying to get into the medium, it's pretty hard to actually discern the difference between the two, especially when you're not sure what acrylic gouache is, but it still has the gouache name. I find this to be a really unique problem because I have never once tried to buy watercolor paint and accidentally bought acrylic, nor have I ever tried to buy acrylic paint and accidentally bought oil paint. This really seems to be a very unique to gouache type issue to look out for. So just keep that in mind when you are purchasing your gouache to make sure that you're getting the type you actually want. Now, where on this scale does acrylic gouache fall? It falls right next to acrylic paint. And that's because it has opacity, so it's going to have full coverage, similar to acrylic. You can use it in thicker layers to get a more textured appearance, and you also can't re-wet it once it's dry. In essence, this is a really soft body or very kind of smooth and a little more liquidy acrylic paint that is sold in small tubes. I know this is a ton of information for a very kind of niche type topic. I'm curious to know in the comments, what's your favorite type of water media to work with? In the past, I kind of would have periods where I preferred watercolor and periods where I preferred acrylic, like you can see behind me here in this unfinished work that I abandoned when I got curious about gouache. And I have a feeling that gouache is now going to take a huge part of my creative energy, where I will go through periods where I only want to paint with gouache, where I only want to paint with watercolor, and I only want to paint with acrylic at different times. Each has its own purpose and its own place, and they can be all very interesting to use. Most of these mediums you can also use together if you're smart about the way that you layer them on. Of all these ones we talked about today, my least favorite is acrylic gouache because it doesn't seem that different from these other types of acrylic that you can buy more readily. Plus, when I was trying to find gouache, I really wanted gouache itself. I wanted that re-wetting capability because I wanted some of the benefits of oil where you can go in and re-wet and repaint things without having to have the patience of waiting for oil and different layers to dry. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments on things I can explore for you. I really like taking a kind of a science-y vibe. It's definitely not an actual science experiment or anything, but I like being able to kind of go through these different variables and help us understand some of these things better and explore, because it also helps me understand. So if you have any other things that you want me to explore like this, please let me know in the comments, and I hope that you have a magically creative day.